I'm dumping all my beer. Merry Christmas. Diving right in, what happened? I came in to the brewery last Saturday, and one of my mentors and best friends came into the brewery. Shout out Jeff Young of Blue Out Brewing in Austin, Texas, and tasted a few of my beers and said that something tasted a little off. He was being kind about it, but like definitely picking up on some flavor. And he ultimately said that he was picking up a Band-Aid flavor, which is pretty indicative of a wild yeast contamination, most likely Brettanomyces. This is a wild yeast that is pretty much everywhere. This is a common infection in breweries. After tasting a few of the beers, I then kind of tended to agree with him. I had noticed something a little off in the previous 2 batches of beer, specifically one beer that was in a bright tank that was ready to be kegged, and wasn't entirely sure what it was, but I thought it was just like a yeast stress flavor because I was on the later generations of this particular pitch of yeast. And so didn't think too much about it and just kind of assumed that it would clean up. Well, I was wrong. And after admitting defeat, I decided to dump all of the beer that I had on hand and ultimately start from scratch. So this decision was very difficult to make. It sucks. I'm dumping, thousands of dollars worth of product, and I will be closed for probably the next full month in order to catch up and rebrew the beers. So that's kind of the overview of what happened, but let's dive into what caused this and what we can do about it. So generally speaking, in breweries, you propagate yeast in a fermentation, and then you harvest yeast from that fermentation and you repitch it into several subsequent batches of beer. So buying a fresh pitch of yeast is very expensive, and this is a way to reduce the cost per batch of beer and is more efficient and good for having good clean yeast to pitch into as many batches of beer as you need. Unfortunately, with my system and the way that I brew, these lagers take a little bit longer, so the yeast will sit in fermentation tank for an extended period of time, and I'll repitch it in subsequent batches, but I only have 2 fermentation vessels, so if I put a fresh pitch of yeast into one of the fermentation vessels and then harvest and pitch that into another fermentation vessel, both of those vessels are going to be filled for a minimum 3 weeks each. And then I will pitch from one of the batches into the other vessel, and it kind of goes back and forth. The problem with this is that it ultimately will isolate and cause me to reach higher generations quicker because I'm not spreading one generation of yeast colony into several beers. I'm pitching from one tank into the next tank, which is the second generation, pitching from that tank into the third, and back into the first tank. That'd be the third generation. And so what happens is it isolates whatever colony of yeast is in there, whether it's like super healthy or whether it's not as healthy. And if there is any contamination, that will propagate more quickly throughout those generations. So the source of the contamination is still unknown, but I have a strong suspicion that it has to do with my heat exchanger. So my heat exchanger is a plate heat exchanger. This thing. The way heat exchangers works is cold water runs on one side of a thin metal plate and the hot wort runs on the other side, and they transfer heat from the wort to the cold water, and this is a way to effectively cool the beer during knockout. Unfortunately, my heat exchanger is a brazed metal heat exchanger, so that means that all of the plates, there's probably 20 to 30 plates in there, they're squished together and they're actually physically brazed or kind of like soldered together. So there's no way to open it up and inspect it. A lot of larger breweries will have a heat exchanger that has several metal plates, but they are sandwiched together with gaskets. So there is a possibility of opening it up and inspecting and cleaning it out. There's a lot of differing opinions on whether you should do that or not, but effectively, I am not able to open my heat exchanger and inspect it. And on this deep clean that I'm currently in the middle of, trying to isolate where this contamination may have come from, I clean my heat exchanger 3 or 4 different times with caustic solution, and each time I'm getting each time I'm getting some sort of residue in the caustic solution, meaning that there's a potential that it is not being cleaned effectively, which kind of sucks because all I have to do is I run a pump with hot caustic water through there and rinse it and just kind of hope for the best. So that is an unfortunate downside to this particular heat exchanger, but that's where my suspicions are. And then outside of that, if there was a contamination, a source in that heat exchanger, once it goes into a beer, it will propagate with the yeast. But the sneaky thing about this contamination is that it kind of creeps over generations. So it's not like a blatant boom in your face. You can tell that this is a Belgian yeast strain or this is pure Brettanomyces. It's just a small portion of the total colony that's fermenting the beer. And so it's not really noticeable if you just get contamination in a batch of beer and then that beer served within a month, you're not gonna pick it up. But if you have that same yeast colony and you repitch it into multiple batches, that contamination will start to grow and become perceivably noticeable. And that is what happened on this particular instance, and it's a bummer. So I now have several kegs that I need to empty and thoroughly clean. I have 2 fermentation vessels that I need to rip apart and deep clean and get a fresh pitch of yeast and brew another batch of beer. So this is a huge setback and it's unfortunate, but one of the positive notes is that this happened during the Christmas holiday, and the beer industry, bar industry, restaurants, whatever, retail service industry is generally the slowest time of year, January, February. So it couldn't have happened at a better time, but it also is a huge hit to the ego and a huge hit to the bank account, unfortunately. So this is it's a tough lesson to learn. I should have done better. I should have picked this up on my own. And I wanted to touch on that as well. So the reason that it took somebody else coming in and giving their unbiased, objective opinion about my beer is that I've been pretty isolated here at Tanglefoot, and frankly pretty distracted mentally. So all of the stressors of running this business, it hasn't been going great. It's been pretty slow, and just kind of trying to figure out what I want to do with the business has been top of mind. And then that gets compounded with the fact that I generally, at the end of a shift or when I take beer home to drink, I generally go for the 12 degree pale lager because it's just my favorite beer. And this particular batch of 12 degree is the oldest batch of beer that I have on hand. In fact, there's like a gallon of beer left in the keg. So it was about to blow and I was about to have to switch to the new batch. So that batch in particular didn't have any of this off flavor that I was picking up in the other beers. So it hadn't propagated at that point. Maybe that batch wasn't infected like the other batches were, but I was just going for that every day, and so wasn't really drinking the other beers too frequently. I would have a taste here or there, but another weird phenomenon that I don't know if it's, I'll just call it like the solo brewer bias, but I am the only person that is here like objectively critiquing my beers. And so when I taste something or I have an idea in my head about what flavor I'm perceiving, it's really easy for me to talk myself in or talk myself out of what I'm tasting because I have a natural bias of the beers that I brew. And I happen to like the beers that I brew, so I have a positive bias towards them and want to think that everything is okay. So that is definitely a flaw about running an operation solo. You don't have anybody to bounce ideas off of or get critical feedback, which is, yeah, definitely a problem for me. So like I said, this is a really humbling experience and kind of a kick in the balls. So it's, yeah, not fun. Don't recommend, 0 out of 10, but it's something that I had to do because I don't want to serve beer that is not up to my standards. And to be fair, generally speaking, unless you are tasting beer all the time or you taste these beers frequently, it's not a huge, like, noticeable off flavor, but just the fact that it is contaminated makes me not want to serve it. So I am effectively starting from scratch. So I hope that somebody can take away something positive from this, because that's the whole point of me doing these videos, is being, you know, transparent and vulnerable, even if it is kind of like the worst situation. So yeah, hopefully y'all don't have to dump beer, but if something like this ever does come up in your brewery or in a homebrew situation, it's better to just dump the beer and not ruin your reputation, because that's the only one that you got. So with that being said, Merry fucking Christmas, yay to me, Happy New Year. I'll be back on with some more beer stuff soon, but yeah, this is going to be an interesting next month. So stay tuned for more stuff. I'm going to be putting out a fun video that is hopefully more uplifting than this in the near future. So thanks for, paying attention, and yeah, send good vibes. Cheers.